that Russian troops have committed war crimes when they occupied an area outside of Ukraine's capital in February and March. In a report, the rights group says civilians also suffered abuses such as reckless shootings and torture.
The report says civilians suffered abuse at the hands of Russian forces during their failed onslaught on Kiev in the early stages of the invasion launched by the Kremlin on the 24th of February. Russia denies its forces committed abuses.
Even historic move. Amnesty International denounced Russia's unlawful use of force as violations of the United Nations Charter and an act of aggression. International law. This is a move we very rarely. The evidence we have gathered since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began in late February 2022. Russian military forces in serious violations of international law, including sexual killings, indiscriminate attacks against civilians, including in densely populated areas, of cluster munition that being so indiscriminate are banned under international law.
Russia says it is conducting a special operation to disarm Ukraine. Kiev and its western backers say the fascism claim is a false pretext for an unprovoked war of aggression. Ukrainian authorities say they are investigating more than 9,000 potential war crimes by Russian troops. The International Criminal Court is also looking into alleged war crimes.
Abuses against civilians living under siege and failure to protect and secure humanitarian corridors. In other words, we know that the crimes committed against people living around Kiev, which we are reporting on today, are not merely anecdotal, incidental, or collateral. They are part of a pattern that characterized Russia's conduct of the hostilities from the outset, a repeated, large in scale and devastating in impact.
The Amnesty report is the latest to document alleged war crimes committed by Russian forces when they occupied an area northwest of Kiev, including the town of Bucha, where Ukrainian authorities say more than 400 civilians were killed. Moscow withdrew its troops in early April in the area. The report concluded that Russian troops had committed a host of apparent war crimes in Bucha, including numerous unlawful killings.
Right, Donatella Rovera is a Senior Crisis Response Advisor, Crisis Response Program, Amnesty International. She is in Ukraine's capital, Kiev, and joins us now via Zoom. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So let's just first start with what your experiences are when Amnesty International drew up this report. What were you defining as human rights abuses, and what amounts to willful killings of civilians?
So in the past months here in Ukraine, I've been investigating two different patterns of violations of international humanitarian law by Russian forces. The deliberate killings in extrajudicial executions, which happen in Bucha and in a variety of small towns and villages all around in the area north of Kyiv, where Russian forces were in control of these localities, and they executed men individually or in groups, either shooting them dead on the spot or in some cases after holding them for hours, possibly days. And secondly, the bombardment, airstrikes of big residential buildings in Borodyanka, also north of Kyiv, where more than 40 civilians were killed when 8 residential buildings were struck. 6 of these buildings is where the civilians died, most of them in one building. In most cases, People who died were sheltering in the basements. That is the place where they went, hoping to be safe, and yet that is where they perished. And these are attacks that were both disproportionate and indiscriminate, and as such constitute war crimes, in the same manner that the extrajudicial executions of these civilians also constitute war crimes. So this is just in one area of the country.
I mean, just since you have been there, what have you heard, either eyewitness accounts? Russia has been very firm in denying some of these accounts, even going as far as relying on forensic evidence. Bucha, for instance, saying that there's no way that their troops could have been responsible for this. If you look at some of the material that those that have been tied up with, that it was staged. I just want to hear, have you met with some of those who experienced this? Were there eyewitness accounts that could just, contradict these reports by Russia?
Well, yes, and more than that. Specifically, in Bucha, that is one of the places where I've been carrying out these investigations on the ground. I've spoken to eyewitnesses, members of the families of those who were killed, and in several locations where this extrajudicial execution took place, I also found spent bullets and bullet casings. And these are specific bullets that are made in a factory south of Moscow, in Tula. And these are bullets that can only be fired by specific rifles. And these rifles are rifles that are fielded only to some units of the Russian special forces. Also in Bucha, I found some military papers, military documents that belong to Russian soldiers who apparently were killed in the town because there were fierce clashes in Bucha. But these military documents confirm the presence of some of these units of the Russian special forces in Bucha. So the evidence is very compelling. The work that we've carried out at Amnesty International is, as we always do, very detailed. It's not just the testimonies, but it also the material evidence that we were able to collect, both with regard to the extrajudicial executions in Bucha and in other towns and villages in the region, and with regards to the bombardments of the residential buildings in Borodianka.
And I want to find out, are these isolated incidents, and are they isolated to Kiev and Bucha, or are there other occupied areas that have experienced these killings, these reports of torture, bar what's happening in the northeast of the Ukraine's capital?
So I think it would be difficult to say that these are isolated incidents or that these are the doings of some rogue elements of the Russian forces, precisely because they did not happen in one or two places. Every village I visited in the northwest of the capital, in the Kiev region, I found the same pattern, the same type of cases. And that is true of other places that I haven't visited, but I've spoken to journalists and other human rights colleagues who have visited those areas. But even just the areas that I personally visited and the cases that I personally investigated with my colleagues from Amnesty International, this is a pattern, and these are not isolated cases. There are other areas that I also visited in the different parts of the country, in the city of Kharkiv, for example, where there the pattern is one of indiscriminate shelling by Russian forces, including with the use of cluster bombs, and cluster bombs are banned internationally, but they have been used in Kharkiv very frequently, and in a number of the strike locations I found the remains of these cluster munitions. So the issue of violations of international humanitarian law constituting war crimes by Russian forces is in different parts of the country, not just here around the capital.
And I do apologize that we have to cut this short, but thank you for your time, sharing with us what you've gleaned from your investigations. Donatella Rovera is the Senior Crisis Response Advisor, Crisis Response Program at Amnesty International. This is where we end it for this hour. We are back with more news. Do stay with us. This is The Glen.